Welcome everyone to the BusinessOptix Thought Leadership Series. I'm Carrie Moeller, Senior Vice President at BusinessOptix. We're excited today to deliver the session, which is a case study from MIT Lincoln Laboratory, covering how they're shifting their culture to focus on business process improvement. With me today is Dr. Vic Musniks and Phil Weinholz from the lab, and they're going to discuss their approach, the milestones that they've achieved, and overall where they're looking to head going forward. So Vic, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks to all of you for joining the call. Phil and I appreciate this opportunity to share our journey at the laboratory with you. If we could advance the slide. I suspect most of you are pretty familiar with MIT, the university, but you may not be as familiar with the Lincoln Laboratory, which is a Department of Defense federally funded research and development center. And what does all that mean? Well, we get about $1 billion a year from the government, and we have about 4,000 employees. The work we do is primarily of a classified nature, but some of it is in the unclassified space. And what we focus on is solving hard problems that the military or others need solved. And the research that we do covers a whole broad spectrum of what we call mission areas. We do a lot of work for the Air Force, so things that go on planes, go up into space, but we do work for the Navy and things that go under the water and everything in between. We, in our research activities, also build things. So we're not just writing white papers. We build prototypes. If it's something that goes into space, send them up in there, and we don't need more than one of them. If it's something the military decides it needs a lot of, we will transfer our technology to other organizations that commercialize and sell that. We do not sell products. We do not have end users to deal with. We try to keep our sponsors happy so that they keep giving us money, but we're a little bit different from commercial organizations that way. We are quite good at what we do. As an example, last year, there's a R&D World magazine that gives out its top 100 R&D awards. We won 10 of those last year, and over the last 10 years, since they've started giving those out, have won 58 of them. So quite successful in the kind of research work that we do. We are very much an organization that's concerned with security because much of our work is classified, and so that aspect of what we do drives a lot of our thinking and how we approach things. So if I get to the next slide, you might think then that things are going quite well if we're achieving that kind of success, and in fact they are. But we do have some problems, and this simple graphic here illustrates that our complexity has been going up over time. We started in the 50s in response to the Cold War and doing radars and the SAGE program and so forth. Much of what we do, I think, still is rooted in how we started doing things back then. And as our size grows, the number of people grow, all of a sudden we're developing this gap between the complexity of how we do things and the way that we can support that with the capabilities across the lab. Some of that complexity is external, and the government's asking for all kinds of different reporting requirements to meet. Some of that's self-inflicted because we have 55 different groups inside the laboratory that all want things done kind of their own way. So if we advance the build, what we're really trying to do is, in our case, flatten our top blue line there curve, not as in the COVID sense, but to bring that complexity down. And a lot of what we'll talk about on this call is what we're doing to reduce that kind of complexity through standardization and streamlining and focusing on processes. And we're also trying to raise that line at the bottom to increase our capability. And even the last few weeks, we've discovered that we can make almost years worth of progress on things like remote working for our researchers in terms of technologies to help with moving that line up a fair amount. So if we advance the slide here, what we did as a lab in typical lab fashion when we realized that we have a problem like this is we put together a study group to look into what's causing the problem and make some recommendations on what we need to do to address that. This slide lays out a number of the key recommendations that we had, and establishing kind of an overall process ownership, governance, and metrics for getting much more efficient and effective in how we support the researchers in terms of our business processes was kind of at the top of the list. And there are also a bunch of technology related needs, and these get intertwined with what we do, but we're going to focus on kind of the top one for this talk. And what came out of also this study was the need to form a kind of a lab-wide transformation program. We call it our Digital Enterprise Transformation Program, and put in charge a few folks to make sure that we were focused on it, that we were executing on it, and that we weren't losing sight of what that was all about. So if we go to the next slide, the group itself was formed with the support and sponsorship of our COO, and I can't overemphasize the need for senior level support for any activities of this type. It's absolutely critical. If you can get your CEO, that's probably the best. The rest of the C-suite is very important as well. And when we put together our business, our BTO, obviously the mission of the lab is to enable this state-of-the-art technology research, and we clearly need to align our people and our processes and our technologies in support of that, but also put together the supporting infrastructure in terms of just architecture and technology. And the team that we put in place here was really sort of handpicked by the COO in terms of leaders from our business units, our research teams, and communications organizations. So we put 9 full-time people into this office, really as essentially primarily a program management office, a PMO to drive and make sure that we're executing on things, but also had an equal number of people like Phil and myself who are working part-time in support of the office, as well as having other jobs and roles within the lab itself. So let's move on to the next slide. One of the first things that we did, and the COO was the one that was talking about this to our laboratory community, was to put together a set of guiding principles. When we established the BTO, we knew it was going to be transitional in time. That 5 years on the previous slide, that's kind of 5 plus or minus a few years. We don't know exactly how long it's going to take, but we know that there are some mindsets that we want to have changed inside the laboratory. And these 5 principles are really the ones that, if we achieve these principles, we'll know that the job of the BTO was well done. And you can't just edict this and say we're going to do this and go away. This is the hard work of what we're all about. So getting our focus to be on the laboratory and enterprise-wide rather than on the individual 55 groups that we have doing their own wonderful research. And instead of building custom solutions for each one of those, moving on to much more standardized functionality in base kinds of products and what we do. We really want to make sure that people are sharing knowledge, and our researchers do this well amongst themselves, but that security focus that we have and kind of this who has the need to know often prevents us from sharing our knowledge, especially between our operations and our research groups. So we wanted to be much more collaborative and much more transparent in the way that we operate to get that gap closed between those organizations. We also want to make sure that we're designing for our users first. Right now, we seem to design for ease of execution by our departments first. And so getting to where we simplify things and really focus on efficiency from the end user point of view is really critical to us. We also want to make sure that we're cultivating strategic thinking in terms of looking at how do we continuously improve, how do we do it for the whole lab, not just siloed on a particular division or department in terms of what's happening, and that our employees, especially our non-research employees, feel empowered to do things inside the organization. Right now, we're very top-down directed, almost military-like, and we want to be much more driven with ownership of people with their processes and activities that they're involved in. So a lot of change that we're trying to work throughout the organization. Next slide, please. The way we start driving some of that change is through projects. This is just a sampling of a few of the projects that the Business Transformation Office is involved in. And most of these projects are not actually led by the BTO. The BTO is there to help facilitate cross-departmental linkages. So on these slides, like the onboarding and the workforce and the travel, the group on the left side of those icons is the one that really is the owner and driver of those projects. So onboarding is driven by HR, our external workforce management, subcontracting, if you will, led by our contracting department, and travel in terms of our financial organization. But the BTO has come in and tried to help get a broader perspective on how these things work cross company, strategic focus. Onboarding was going to be done just by our HR team with what they cared about. We sort of stopped that midstream and said, no, it has to be broader. You have to reach out to these other groups, departments, get their requirements in place. And we've been highly successful at what we've implemented. People are now reporting back from what used to be a pretty poor experience to this is the best experience I've had coming into companies. And we've even extended it now with process changes to support people that we hire and are working from their home offices, getting equipment and so on, never having even stepped into the laboratory at this point in time. The one project here that is very much driven from the Business Transformation Office is our business project management focus, which goes very much lab-wide. Next slide, please. And the goals that we put in place for that particular activity, probably not rocket science type goals, nothing new that we're creating and inventing here, is really to look at business process management in a way that's going to take us from our current state, which actually is not a particularly great state to be in, into a future state where we really want to be in terms of those mindsets and those key principles. And when you're in a current state like we are, it's not hard to see improvements being made. When I first joined the laboratory, I was told, well, it's going to take you a couple of years just to figure out how this place works. And I thought to myself, even at that time, well, why is that? I mean, wouldn't we want to make sure I'm productive from day one rather than having to wait a couple of years before figuring out how things take place? And as we looked at our processes, even some quick looks, because no one had ever peeked under the covers on those, there's one process I recall that had about 20 steps involved across 5 different departments. When we noticed that people were doing the same thing multiple times across those different groups, we cut it down to maybe 8 steps and really speeded up the time just by having taken a look at what people are doing rather than letting things just run the way that they always have been. So if we move to the next slide in terms of how we're going about trying to make some of these changes come about, the life cycle that we're using is pretty standard. We've spent a lot of time in just the process identification. What are the processes that exist inside the laboratory? Who are the owners of those processes? We're not a place that has, in fact, had process ownership. Processes are things that kind of happen. People don't feel that they own a process. And so we're trying to change a lot of that. We're also putting a lot of emphasis into the analysis of kind of not only once we figure out what the model is, but what should it be? How do we optimize it? How do we make it better? A lot of our folks want to jump to that redesign right away, and we've been having to kind of make sure that people are at least documenting and writing down what the current processes are before we jump into that kind of a change. If we move to the next slide, the way that we're trying to implement some of this business process management is both by working with the folks that own processes, but also from the top level down and really leveraging our sponsorship with the COO. And so the first group that we went after were our department heads for our various service departments who report into the COO. We had to make things kind of simple in terms of what it was that we wanted to do. This kind of a chart broke down the different steps and stages that we wanted to go through and show our progress against those different stages with them. In the early days, probably a little over a year ago, when I was leading our evaluation for what sorts of tools do we need to use in this space and technology, this is where I wind up recommending that we choose BusinessOptix. And the big reasons here were not because it was the best business process modeling kinds of tools and interfaces that even those folks at that time would have said, yeah, they needed to make some improvements, which they have certainly done since that point in time. But because the whole BusinessOptix approach dovetailed very nicely with what we wanted to do with our business transformation journey. We could keep track of our workshops that we were running with people. We could link those to the processes that we had. We could do our transformations. We could look at and plan for things like process mining over time and getting to our actual data and so forth, all in one tool, all in one place without having to move and copy stuff from one repository to another and keep track of things. So making that choice was really important to us, explaining to our senior leadership why this was such an important element to our business transformation office was all part of that first phase 0. And even getting us, because we are so security conscious, to working in a cloud-based environment where our data leave our premises, even though it's not our technical data, it's more of our administrative data. That security mindset around, what do we keep in-house versus what do we let go externally is something we had to battle even from day one. And then making sure that these leaders were involved in understanding that they had to be personally involved in that next phase of establishing the core processes inside each of the divisions and who the owners of those processes were. Those were key steps for engaging them and making sure that they could see the progress that was being made. It certainly helped that our COO was even willing to work that into the plans, performance plans for each of the individual leaders in terms of making progress on this. And then we had laid out that we're going to be doing a lot of as-is modeling and then moving into our to-be state and a lot of continuous feedback and monitoring of how the processes were in place. And the key thing we had to do here was make sure people understood that we weren't measuring them on how good their processes were today. What we wanted to do was have them make improvements and see growth and efficiency on these processes over time. So next slide, please. When we started getting into the actual use of the tool and modeling, our first step was to put in place an overall kind of simple operating model that people could relate to. They could see where they fit in. The blue lines at the top there, the key processes for our research was, we come up with these brilliant ideas, we figure out some way of getting them funded, we execute on them, and then we transfer that technology to wherever it needs to go. That's the basic research business model that we have, if you will, supported by all of these different groups and departments. So if you give me the next build, please. What we had to do for each of these groups and departments was start modeling, well, what are the processes that each one is using? So each of those black boxes, we wound up putting a person from the BTO to work with each of the department heads to start structuring, well, what are your key processes and sub-processes inside the organization? For some, this was fairly natural. They've done this. For others, this was totally revolutionary and never thought about things this way before. We had a lot of work just in terms of going back and forth. How many of these processes do we have? We used resources like the APQC models because you can download those nicely into spreadsheets. They're by industry. Aerospace is the closest ones to us. So that would give them sort of well, what is the industry standard for doing things in an HR organization or in an IT department and so forth. And if you give me the next build slide, it took us a fair amount of activity to get down to a single owner for each one of these activities. And that in itself is valuable to us in terms of just understanding who owns all of the processes. But that also meant we had to hold training activity of making sure these owners understood, well, what does it mean to be a process owner? What am I supposed to do? What am I accountable for? What decisions can I make? And how do I have to interact and work with other process owners? Next slide, please. When we got through those first couple of phases, we then had to kind of go back to the same department heads and say, all right, well, we've checked off a couple of the boxes here with you, but recall that that's just kind of the starting point of this journey. The real hard work begins now as we start trying to get into the next level of detailing the process steps, putting the actual models in place for how all these things work. And that's going to take time and energy and effort. So you're going to have to dedicate some resources to support these process owners. Some of the process owners may want to model these processes themselves. Some may need someone who can work with the technology. We're certainly not process experts by any means across the organization, and that you're going to have to help champion this. And so we even provided them with some tools. One of the most popular ones was what we called a visual management board for the monitoring the progress, where you have color-coded the processes inside your organization, and 6 different steps that they would go through, from kind of a grayish that hasn't been really started yet through to it's starting to have workshops and we have things on paper to see what we're doing, and that starts getting yellow because we're starting to maybe put it into the modeling system, down to when it's fully approved and operational and green. And each of these boxes could be highlighted in some way, like a bolder border for the high priority processes, and they might have initials on them, like who the process owners are, and maybe even target dates for some of this stuff, so you could at a glance see what's going on. These boards would be pretty big and they'd be posted visually so everybody in the organization could see them and know that, hey, this stuff's important and where's this stuff moving and how do we make progress along each of these different dimensions. And then if we get to the next slide, one of the key things that helped us was having a very, very major technology project, which was to upgrade our ERP infrastructure, our enterprise resource planning with SAP, and needing to modernize that. That allowed us to help prioritize for folks out of all of these processes that we've identified, which ones are really critical to get documented and to understand for this implementation. Many of them, of course, are finance related. Some of them are contracting and HR and so forth. But we had about 260 some odd processes that we'd identified at kind of our level 3. Within those, we had almost 800 sub-processes. And so, you can't do all of it at once. And this really helped us with figuring out where could we put our focus and how do we kind of jointly take and advance our technology with our process modeling and with a number of our other capabilities. And we discovered that for us, because as I said, we're not process experts, it took us somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks per complex process to really run through the workshops that we needed, bring in stakeholders from different parts of the organization, not just involve the group that's running the process, but really get this kind of feedback, do the modeling, get it through the systems, and get things approved. And so we really wanted to, at that point, start prioritizing the quality of what we were doing over the speed at which we were trying to make some of this happen. But we wanted to make sure it was done in time to support our implementation activities and rollouts. The next slide, please. The other things that I would say really were important for us was putting together kind of a governance structure for what we were doing across this environment and focus in on our process owners and the training for those. So for us, the governance really is a partnership between our tool vendor, in this case, BusinessOptix, who really works with us in a very collaborative style here and gives us a lot of initial guidance and what do other companies do at this stage of their development and understanding of this whole business process landscape, and how do we onboard the tool itself and so on, along with our IT organization and our BTO folks. So we have a governance team of about 11 members here who get together on a weekly basis. We're often staying, a week or two ahead of what we're asking the rest of the lab to do. And this is where we make all the decisions around how are we really structuring things. What are going to be the swim lanes that these processes have in terms of the roles that we want to have consistently across the laboratory. One of the first things we had to do was put together a little one-page set of guidelines for here are the things you should do and the things you should not do if you're going to be modeling processes. Start your boxes with verbs. Don't have more than 10 or 15 boxes in a process model. Break stuff out into sub-processes if you need to, and so on. And then make sure that those kind of rules were implemented in the tool. The BusinessOptix tool is great at having capabilities that let you verify, is this process model conformant to the rules of the BPM, the business process modeling standards. But when it would give you feedback, it would give you often dozens and dozens of messages, which a normal human wouldn't be able to understand because they don't understand all this BPMN notation modeling terminology. And we were able to scale back so that only those messages that we thought were relevant to people at any given time were the ones that we were giving them feedback about. We also put together checklists of best practices. Those have since grown into whole wiki pages that we maintain and update constantly, and our authors for processes use religiously in terms of understanding what they're trying to do. We made sure that we were working very much on our workflow and approval processes. We had multiple stages we wanted things to go through. We wanted visibility at the right point in time up through our division department levels before we go public, but also across other departments, and also that we were following these checklist rules from a just consistency point of view in terms of good modeling practice. And we've worked with BusinessOptix, who are really great at adding capabilities into the product at times to support this and rolling it out for others to use. We also had to take into account a lot of the permissioning information and who has access and rights to see data at what point in time. So setting up our folder structures with who can work on stuff and who can see that versus when does it become publicly available. Some of these processes we may never want to have publicly available. For example, within our security organization, the way we want to respond to active shooter incidents, that's not something we want to make sure people can see because if they were going to be an active shooter, we wouldn't want them to know how we were going to deal with them. So lots of this kind of infrastructure. This was also the team that could then figure out at what point in time do we introduce extensions to the basic modeling of processes to now start embellishing those models with things like, well, what data are you actually using in this process? What systems do you interact with? Put together the list of our application systems. We certainly have hundreds of those now, just like hundreds of role models in the system, our org structures. The nice thing about the tool is that it allows us to put a variety of models into the tool. So it's not just process models, but we can have our data models and link and see those in different kinds of ways. And we can put in our organizational models, and we can link to our workshop results and see where in those workshops we have gaps and issues that we want to fix in certain models. And we have our IT type models and networking models. We've got very detailed models now for our SAP implementation on all of the different functionality that we've got to address there. We will continue to add in new capabilities over time here and exploit what the tool can do for us, such as process mining, such as a lot of the simulations and transformation activities, which we've started with some of our process owners today. And we'll look to our BusinessOptix for guidance in terms of how do we approach this in a way that's going to make the most sense to us, and what have others found that works well or doesn't work well in that kind of environment. And in parallel, this same group is the one that's involved with the training, and I really think of it as kind of building the community of a lot of our process modelers today. We started off with BusinessOptix doing a lot of great training for us on the basics of how you model in a tool like this. But we discovered that we very quickly had to start training people really on our model with our kind of top level view, where our process structures fit and so on. So we took that over. Phil is our champion for doing a lot of that kind of activity. And we've then, since then, not only trained people, which is what gave them kind of the license to get in and start modeling in our system, and they also had to do approvals forms that they submitted so that they were acknowledging the kind of data that they were working with, that it was in a cloud environment and so forth, so that they'd be careful as to what they put in. But we've now started offering weekly peer reviews on the modelings that's going on, and then monthly workshops on new techniques and new processes to share and build out this community. So lots of great things going on, both from a governance and how do we move the tool and capability forward, because we do see this as, even if the BTO goes away, over time, this tool, this repository, this set of information, along with the changes in culture and habit and behavior that we're trying to instill, is what will have a very long-term life at the laboratory. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Phil to go into more of the details about how we've been working in some of these areas. Phil?
Yep. Thank you, Vic. I think Vic does a really good job of presenting the large view and the large vision of the lab, and the historical strategic initiatives and the future plan for where things are going. I was hired at Lincoln a little over a year ago, and one of the initial projects that I was asked to work on was the integration of BusinessOptix into Lincoln Laboratory. So my strategic work on this specifically was taking a lot of those large vision ideas and those large deliverables and transfer them into immediate concrete deliverables that translate to all the users at the lab. So part of that is working with a governance group that helps to manage and supervise this on a week-to-week basis, and that's really been a key piece to this, is working with that team and group. And for those on the call, I can't thank you enough for joining in today. If you can advance to the next slide. So part of that was definitively defining what are the different levels of information that we're going to be mapping and charting. And especially within the space, levels can mean many different types of things. So we've had to very concretely define those parts. So the first part of that is this organizational diagram, this top level diagram that was generated to look at the different departments and entity types within the lab that we were going to map to. And if you can advance. So each of those links to a level 1 diagram of those individual departments and offices, which shows 2 more zones, the level 2s and level 3s. So if you can advance 2 more clicks. And each of those has a drill down point. Now, one of the large projects that we're working on now is creating the map for each of those level 3s. So whenever there's an arrow on a level 3, it then takes you into a more detailed and much more advanced diagram and chart. So the travel office in specific here is one of the first departments that we worked with because they were going through a transformation, and the as is, which is the current state of the process, needed to be mapped versus the to be, the future proposed state, so it could be presented to key stakeholders across the lab and within the department itself. You can advance another click now. So the level 4 layer of detailed information is what's actually happening within the department. So the beauty of this is within seconds, an individual can go from the larger level 1 finance organizational view and with a click, then start to drill into that specific department. And I'm actually reminded of some of my mom's graduate level work that she did when she was a graduate student, which was organizationally mapping, org charting. How do you generate these views? And so the beauty of this is within seconds, you can go into these individual departments and offices and start to really at a micro level see the individual steps that those departments are doing. You can advance one more click now. So beyond those flows, you can click onto an activity and it will provide you level 5 details. So level 5 details are the notes, but without the context of the level 1, 2, 3, or 4, it would be very difficult to know what that means, know the larger context. So again, within 5 to 10 seconds, a user at Lincoln Lab now can drill into that level 5 detail with that greater level of context and start to drill through those activities and link to on-premise hosted environments also. So we've linked this to the local on-prem document management system so that we're interconnecting and tying together systems at Lincoln Laboratory. And currently we have 26 of these published at the level 4 and level 5 level. The goal is that within the next 6 to 12 months, we'll advance that, ultimately having more than 270 level 3 processes published for Lincoln Lab use, consumption, and mapping of the transformation of certain key processes. You can advance. One of the beauties of BusinessOptix is that we're able to take the software and really customize it to the language and the vision of Lincoln Laboratory. So this whole homepage was customized with their version 7 that was launched in the last year as we were demoing the software. And so on this page, we were able to note that it's a cloud-based system, which we worked with the Security Services Department to review and explore, define what BPM is within the context of the lab, provide a note regarding BusinessOptix, and then create a very specific narrative where we worked with both the Business Transformation Office and the Technical Communications Office to create that narrative that would translate to general users at Lincoln Lab. So the first step is getting started, where users sign up for training, they read and accept the terms of use, which is policy that's in place by the Security Services Department. So all the authors know the appropriate type of information to enter within the tool, roles and responsibilities, which are individual author and owner roles while working within the tool, then creating the model. So to simplify it for users, we create a quick start button that bypasses a page, which is really nice in BusinessOptix, which gives you anywhere from 15 to 20 different stencils that you can use to map and chart different pieces of your organization. Specifically, the primary initiative for this is mapping out processes. So this brings them directly to a form page where they can enter initial details and then start their process within seconds, really. An Excel tool that we created for our initial users where they can enter some initial details and information, BPMN 2.0 checklist, which was essentially a synthesis of the 500 plus page document that was generated by the Object Management Group, which is one of the global entities that manages BPMN 2.0 compliance. So this in a 2-page format provides our users with a very simple step-by-step way to translate that data into the tool. Explore brings people directly to the top level diagram where they can then go explore those 270 plus level 3s at Lincoln Laboratory. And then an ongoing Get Help section where we have a user guide, which links to our on-site Confluence page, which goes into great detail within the context of the tool and the software for Lincoln Laboratory. Training overview, which is a slide that we use, a slideshow that we use for our weekly and monthly trainings for users at Lincoln Laboratory. The BusinessOptix Help Center, which brings them directly to the BusinessOptix Help page, which gives them a larger view and a larger context of the tool, software, and what they can do, and then a contact us page, which brings them directly to a mail to form. You can advance the slides. So mapping isn't new to Lincoln Laboratory. It's actually something that's been done quite extensively, especially in Visio, and we've done a great deal of discovery of those maps and those charts. But BPMN 2.0 is very new, and except for maybe a handful of users, this was a whole new system and framework that was being layered on the lab. And it's not just the lab, it's really everywhere, because BPMN 2.0 is a standard that was just created within the last 5 to 10 years. And it took several years for even software companies to integrate it within their software. So in some ways, let's say OSHA had just been created within the last 5 years. It was essentially going in and saying, okay, here's OSHA, now we have to apply it across all the building at the lab. So as a part of that, we're able to detail out and provide samples and descriptions of all the different objects and elements that you can create within the tool. And this is a sample of a page that's in BusinessOptix that we migrated into the Confluence page. It provides a sample of all the different activities, gateways, events, pools, artifacts, and linkages that you can create with a detailed description for each of those. If you can click through to the next. And then we can link and tie those to specifically how they're going to generate those maps. So we show the swim lanes there, and then we show the systems, which is very important because we can link those all to master data. To this date, we've generated in the ballpark plus or minus 300 systems within the tool that exist at Lincoln Laboratory, and plus or minus 400 different roles that exist at Lincoln Laboratory too, to create a standard language that users can link to. Because what ends up happening is across departments, one person may refer to something as center and another as central. And so then you can end up with 2 or 3 variations of that system just based on that. And so then this way, there's a generalized, standardized language and dialect that occurs. So while 300 to 400 systems and roles may sound like a lot, prior to doing this, that number could have been in the thousands. You can advance the slide. So the governance process is very important for all of this. And what we do with every process when we go to publish it is we go through a very specific workflow process that was customized with the software and the tool, and with specific strategic members of the Business Transformation Office, and going through a workflow process that would be consistent with other publication processes at Lincoln Laboratory. So peers could review the process, department heads and department managers and process owners could review the process, and then ultimately technical governance review with members of the governance group could go through and review it as well. So there are 3 reviews that occur: peer review, department level review, governance review, and then it gets published and approved for lab consumption, which is the 26 that have currently gone through that process in the last 6 months. If you advance to the next click. So if you click through that, we use the tool ourselves to map this out, as that concept and that framework can be very complex for average users. So we've mapped out what it looks like to map a process within the tool. And if you click again, what it looks like to review by the peers, and so on and so forth. And we have that mapped in the internal system, and this is something that we share with our users, both within BusinessOptix and within our Confluence page, is that there is a flow that was predefined for this, and we can also custom tailor it as we go to help define it, to help our users go through, and subsequently we've published 26 through this process. You can advance now. So this is a slide that we use when we do our monthly and sometimes weekly trainings in the agenda. So we welcome our users, explain to them why they're there. We share the slide, which is the map that we created for business process management. So we identify business process owners. They accept the process ownership. So they'll be the manager for that process on behalf of Lincoln Lab and for Lincoln Lab. Then they go through owner training, process ownership, and BPM design thinking. From there, they go to owning a process, developing it, monitoring, and there are extensive sub-processes that those link to. Then the next question they ask themselves after going through that is there a need for improvement? If there is, then they need to align it with the business needs so that it's consistent with Lincoln Laboratory's policies and procedures. Then they'll go and implement the change, which there's a sub-process for, and then cyclically go through that cycle until they can get to the point where they say, no, there isn't a current need for improvement. And then they revisit it every 3 months, and you can actually set that within the tool to get reminders with whatever frequency you need, whether it's 3, 6, 9, 12 months. If it's weekly, monthly, you have that capability within the tool. You can advance to the next slide. Another beauty of the software and the advancing of Lincoln Laboratory is the lab is starting to get more and more systems into software as a service, which gives us the opportunity to work with our provider, but also gives us a lot of interfaces that BusinessOptix is working on a month-to-month basis. So we're able to do things like manage process owners and statuses in the tool. You can advance the slide. Monitor weekly activity, user activity, and participants versus authors in the tool. So the beauty of it is, as users are going in here, it provides us real-time analytics and data that we can use. The BTO can report up to management so they can view this also, and then we can receive strategic direction and vision. And on a week-to-week basis, we're constantly implementing and updating the system to better represent Lincoln Laboratory and its goals. You can advance the slide. So with that data, the BTO then goes and works with other software systems such as Tableau, where they can map and chart these in strategic maps for the laboratory, present this to leadership, and share it. So this is the total enterprise business processes, and it shows the optimized draft and process, the as-is draft and process, and as-is to be documented. And you can advance the slide. And within each department, it shows that specifically month by month, so we can see which department is advancing, where they're at currently with the processes, and how we can keep things on a current timetable, which can get adjusted month to month based on the number of processes and the entire discovery that's going on. You can advance the slide. And all of this is within the larger organizational vision of the lab. And this is a slide that Samar Mankara, one of our business data architects at Lincoln Laboratory, created. So you essentially have two sides of the house. You have research and you have operations. And then there's certain portions of research and operations that overlap with one another and are shared and impact the entire lab. So we have EDA, enterprise data architecture, we have business processes, and we have enterprise applications. So specifically, if you flow through business processes, which this is tied to, we have tooling, business process governance, business process training and education, communication change management, business process work streams, and pilots and proofs of concepts. So these are all different groups and teams that are working on the project, that are involved strategically, and working within the tool and working within the framework to make sure that there's a consistent vision for Lincoln Laboratory. You can advance the slide. So while we're working within that framework, there's also this slide, which was generated initially by my colleague Antonio. And this is a larger strategic vision for BPM. So BPMN 2.0 is the strategic, almost tactical initiative of how do we define this. Business process management is the larger view of how do we now take that and implement that change and vision throughout the laboratory. So there's strategy, plan, transition, continuous improvement. So we're currently in the strategy and planning phase. And then the next steps, which will be part of the BPM ownership, are the transition and continuous improvement. Now, how do we manage organizational change? How do we communicate and train? How do we build a process-centric IT? These are ongoing initiatives that we monitor and work with. And so as we get a little bit further along, these will become more clear. We'll have their own process maps defined to them, and essentially will be how the lab is shaped moving forward. You can advance to the next slide. So in summary, the future of the plans for BusinessOptix, BPM, and Lincoln Laboratory is, it returns us to the slide that Vic shared earlier. We're identifying processes at the top level architecture. We're discovering those by doing mapping workshops and working with the process owners and authors in the department. We're creating as-is models, and then we're conducting analysis of those. In those analysis sessions, we're starting to redesign those processes and going into those next steps of creating transformational to-be models. Then the departments are going forward and implementing those, creating executable models that can be monitored and controlled, and then cyclically going through those process steps as processes are being monitored, implemented, and redesigned. Key business process lessons that we've learned from the past. the lab's business and process are not always understood or documented. So that we're peeling and opening up in the discovery process. And at times there's been over-reliance on customization to satisfy business needs. So by pre-analyzing those steps before developing and creating, we're creating solutions that maybe don't need deep customization and key development, but just slightly different business process steps so that the owners can communicate it to the larger community. Establish business process modeling framework in partnership with the departments. So we identify clear process ownership and maturity, streamlined and simplified where possible, share metrics, measuring process efficiency, starting to establish a culture of continuous improvement for process owners, and is a part of the larger DT initiative at Lincoln Laboratory. Key next steps: educate process owners on responsibilities, document business process details, steps, data, systems, and metrics, initiate targeted process improvement efforts, design thinking-based workshops and broad participation, explore process simulation, transformation, process mining, technology capabilities, and techniques. And these are the steps that we're currently going through with Lincoln Laboratory. At this point, I'd like to pass it to Carrie so we can field some Q&A questions, and I appreciate you taking time to listen in today.
Yeah, so everyone, I'm going to unmute all. We've got plenty of time here, 15 or so minutes to ask questions if you have them. You can also go to the dashboard that comes up, and there is a questions panel if you want to submit questions that way. What we ask is for you guys to follow BusinessOptix on LinkedIn as we continue this thought leadership series. We've got several more coming up. So I'll pause here and see if there's any questions.
Carrie, there had been a question about will the recording of the webinar be available afterwards? And I think you are going to make that happen, correct? Can you
Correct.
give some details on where folks could find that, or will you send out a note on that?
That'll be sent directly to them, anybody who registered, so we will send that out just after. Let's see, question for Vic and Phil. They're asking how long you have worked with BusinessOptix.
I believe we first connected with you guys sometime around February of last year as part of the analysis that we were doing of various tools and things out there. You responded to my question to your website in about 30 minutes with a phone call, and we've had pretty consistent interactions since then. So a little over a year at this point in time.
Great. And another question I got, how did you manage the change management of the organization?
That's an ongoing activity. And so for us, it starts very much from the top in terms of the COO taking a very, very active role in talking about this whole transformation activity, the value and need for the business transformation office. We have an individual whose full-time job it is to manage change management from the business transformation office. Now, obviously, that person can't do it all, but they put out kind of a methodology framework for how we do this in the individual projects that we work on. There are people who are assigned the role of doing the change management with that. There's communication. The head of our BTO talks to our various forums, group leaders. We have regular meetings with the department heads and others across the organization. So there's this constant reinforcement of what we're doing and what we're about. We have built websites internally for the Business Transformation Office and the DET program, the wikis that Phil referred to, all of the training and workshops that we've been running. It's never enough, and you always want to do more because people are resistant to change. We're working on their habits, their behaviors. We don't necessarily believe that you can change culture per se, but you can change people's habits and behaviors, and then that leads over time to changes in culture. And knowing that different types of change require different types of techniques. And for the most part, we're trying to do sort of a top-down and directed change, which is much harder than when it bubbles up from folks. But the more that they experience kind of the style of working and then the empowerment and seeing that's being allowed in some sense, they're picking up on it. So it's a constant thing. We do have some people focused on it, but we can never do enough of it. I don't know, Phil, if you have some other things you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, it's an ongoing process. It's something that we work on a daily basis. That's why we have the governance team in place. While there is a full-time individual monitoring that directly, there are tens, if not more, people implementing that. We work with our strategic process owners throughout the laboratory, and so the message on that is continually flowing through different individuals at the lab. So it's something that we do on a day-to-day basis, both by using the software and the tool to monitor and manage the development and the advancement of both master data and the processes, but then also communicating with those owners on how those processes are working and where there are opportunities for change and improvement exist.
Great, thank you. One final question. Can you just comment on the strategy of the BTO and the fact that you hope that this embeds in culture in that department can go away?
Yeah, the whole point of putting it in place as a known transitory type of an organization was so that people really do understand that they've got to kind of get this into their own DNA, and that it's not going to be some external group that continues to do this on their behalf, but that this is going to be what they wind up having to do. It is an expense to have an organization like this. The laboratory can afford to do it this time, but it can't afford to do it forever. And so I think that was a very conscious decision made at the COO level. And I think it's an effective one in that, you know, people know that we're working toward a particular outcome and result, and that maybe it's a little bit, you know, the faster you do it, the quicker you get yourself out of a job in that way, type of thing. But it definitely is something that we don't want to have there forever, and that we want that to be part of this continuous improvement that people do. And so the work that we're starting and showing and kind of being exemplars of is just to get the ball rolling, and that others will pick up on it and keep that same kind of activity going, just not needing a separate organization to make that happen. It just becomes part of the way that the things are done.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that is all the questions we have. If you do have further questions or want to connect with Vic or Phil to have a more detailed conversation, you can see my email address up there. Just shoot me a note and I'm happy to connect you. And then just so you know, our upcoming Thought Leadership Series subjects, we're going to have a recording on managing key processes and automation strategies in the new normal, which will be given by Jim Steiner, who is a former Gartner analyst and an independent analyst now. And then why a digital twin of your organization is critical to your growth strategy, which will be given by an industry analyst as well. So we hope you join us for that. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future. Vic and Phil, really appreciate your time and talk track through your process.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks all for listening.